skies will be filled with the greatest air armada the world has ever seen. Our own Army Air Forces, the best planes ever built, 65,000 planes this year. And by the time you finish your training, America will have overwhelming superiority in the air.
I'm Ted Severn. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for coming out today. This is a Germany Day, and part of what we're going to talk about today happens to be in the European theater. So this could be Wildflecken, Germany, or Baumholder, Germany, or for those of you who have been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I think you have about 10 days of sunshine up there, whether you need it or not. I'd also like to thank Bill Barkley this morning. I've gotten to know Bill over the couple of years that I've been volunteering here, and Bill has always been kind, generous. If I've had a question about an airplane, particularly that one, he's answered it. I just spent about an hour in that cockpit and around that airplane last week, making sure that I knew the idiosyncrasies of that airplane. So Bill, thanks very much. And I will also tell you that Bill, when I was asked to do this presentation, Bill said, "Here, Ted, here's 7 books. You need to use these, and you can learn a lot. There's probably more than you can brief in a half an hour, but here you go." And so I really enjoyed those books, Bill. I need to get them back to him, but he's just been so helpful, and I appreciate that very much. And I would like to point out that we're going to talk about this great airplane here today, those kinds of airplanes. This happens to be a B model. You're going to see in a slide here that I'm going to show in a minute that there were over 5,000 of these produced, or 3,000, I'm sorry. 700 of them were B models. That meant they had a little larger tail cone, and the reason they did that was because to make room for a litter area. So if you fold the second seat down, which is where the forward observer sits, and we're going to talk about that guy today, then you can fit a litter in there. So one of the major missions that we're going to talk about was medevac in those kinds of airplanes to get wounded soldiers the heck out of the battlefield, whether it was the Pacific or the European theater. So anyway, thanks, Bill, for all your help. Appreciate that very much. So, as I sat down and tried to figure out what we were going to talk about here this morning, I said, well, what would folks be interested in? And I said, I think, first of all, they'd be interested in kind of an introduction to the L4 and the L5. These are our great L airplanes. There obviously was a 1, 2, and 3, but these are the guys that carried the burden toward the last 3 years of the war, so that's what we're focusing on, and we're just fortunate enough to have an L5. I thought, I don't know where pilots come from, because most of the guys who flew these were in the sergeant's program, and we don't hear very much about that. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Then I thought, people don't know where these were on the battlefield in the theater. So we're going to talk about how they were distributed and what kind of crews were out there in terms of numbers with divisions and so on. And then we're going to talk about one of the major 2 missions that these airplanes flew and the great folks who flew them executed was one, forward observer artillery adjustment, and the other was close air support. And I can tell you we were just evolving at this point in time, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to give you a quick class on the grid system. And then I want to apply 2 European vignettes to this. And then we're going to get into, there's some great, there's a million stories about courageous crews out there. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the Pacific theater, and then we'll get into a summary and so on. So as I thought about this, I began reading these 7 books that Bill gave me. My first combat experience was as a 24-year-old captain, rifle company commander in Vietnam with 101st Airborne Division. I commanded Delta Company, 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry Airborne in what was then an airborne air mobile division. Now it's called an air assault division. And so as I was watching this first video that Bill gave me, I said, man, that looks like Vietnam. And so, I just had a heart for these guys who flew these missions, particularly in the South Pacific right away. And so I said, I'm going to introduce it this way, because this is Army aviation at its purest. And I will tell you, these airplanes were Army aviation at their purest. These are the guys that were where the rubber meets the road with the dismounted infantryman and artilleryman and engineer, be they Marine or Army. And that's why it was so important to me. So I can tell you, we used these Hueys. We used them for assault. Took 22 helicopters to deliver my rifle company into combat in enemy area. I worked heavily with what we call a pink team, white team, and red team. So a pink team was two of these. That was two OH-6 Chaoses, great helicopter, very agile. The guys that flew them used to mount miniguns on them, M60 machine guns, carry grenades, and they would be down there bobbing and weaving with the bad guys, and they would be chucking grenades at them as the bad guys were shooting up from foxholes at them. And by the way, before I made a combat assault, I used to do a recon in one of these, and I can tell you we got shot at more than once. But anyway, great airplane. Pink team happened to be a gunship and one of these combined, so the little guy was down low looking for the bad guys. If a bad guy popped up, we'd roll in with one of the gunships and take him out. Two of those was a red team. We also worked with Air Force pilots in an O-2 aircraft, fixed wing, and that was our forward air control. And the thing I want to point out before I go off this slide was, boy, we evolved so much in the Vietnam time frame and since that time with regard to artillery adjustment and forward air control adjustment. You know, for example, as a company commander, I had a FO officer with me, an artillery officer. So I had two radio telephone operators, a guy who walked in front of me, a guy who walked behind me. One was on my company frequency, one was on the next higher frequency in battalion. And right behind that FO, or that radio telephone operator, was my forward observer. And I used to call artillery all the time, but he had a radio directly to the fire control center. We called it the fire direction center. So when I wanted artillery, he was right there. When you compare that to the World War II guy, he didn't have an artillery with him. So he had to call back to the Tactical Operations Center, the battalion headquarters, and say, hey, I need that artillery that I plotted. And we're going to talk about that a little bit here. And the same with close air support. So if I wanted close air support, I would talk to my Tactical Operations Center, and I would say, I need a FAC on station right now. And within 15 minutes, I think that's the longest I ever waited, I had one of these great guys here. He was orbiting overhead anywhere from 500 to 1,000 feet. I could talk directly to him. I could tell him where the enemy was. I could mark my left and right flank, and we get bombs on target in no time flat. It was not that way in World War II, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I had a lot of comparisons and how much we had improved from World War II, where these concepts were just evolving. So let's move on here. So what I want to do first is introduce our airplanes. So the first airplane is the Grasshopper. It's a Piper J3, and it was designed to be a civilian airplane. It was designed to be a training airplane, and we used them in the military very quickly. The manufacturer was Piper Aircraft Company, so when people talk about the original Piper Cub, this is it. And so there were about 20,000 of those produced, 5,413 for the military. High wing. One of the reasons this airplane was selected, because you can see it has a high wing up here. So that means that if you're the pilot or the crew member, you don't have a wing in the way as you're trying to see what's on the ground. You can get out there and you can look directly down, tilt left or right, port or starboard a little bit, and see what you need to see. There's a little bit about the fuselage. Crew of 2, maximum in this airplane of 455 pounds. That includes everything you're wearing. It might include a radio that the forward observer might bring. And so that was a little bit of a difficulty at times with this particular airplane. As I said, it was designed to be a trainer. And in the civilian version, and they began building these obviously before World War II, they were what they called chrome yellow. And of course, after they were adopted into the military, they became olive drab in color. Let's go into the next piece. So there are the characteristics. I'll let you read those. I would say the only thing that I really want to talk about on this slide is this wing area. 178.5 square feet. That in combination with a 4-cylinder 65 horsepower engine That was not a very high-powered engine, so it needed a big wing to stay aloft. And I will tell you, you'll see a little later on that it has a really low stall speed, about 38 miles per hour. And so the good news is that this airplane could really get into short runways in a hurry, particularly if the airplane was flying into the wind. So that was a great advantage to this airplane here. Let's talk a little bit about some miscellaneous points of interest here about this aircraft. I've already talked about the radio, so I won't talk about that. There were a lot of civilian Cubs out there. There were a lot of them that were used by the Civil Air Patrol. And why is that important? Well, I think that anybody knows a little bit about World War II history knows that we had a lot of German submarines called U-boats off the coast of this country. In fact, if you're a scuba diver, like I have been, there are some great dives on sunken German U-boats off the coast, all the way up and down from probably New Jersey, all the way down south off of Florida. But anyway, so the Civil Air Patrol augmented our Coast Guard and augmented our Navy in flying off the coast and looking for these submarines to report them to get either an air asset or a ship asset out there to sink those guys. So that's interesting. The other thing that I found interesting as I was doing some homework on this was our president, I don't care what you think about him at that point in time, he was pretty smart with regard to trying to project things. And what he said was, after being advised by the Army Chief of Staff, Marshall, he said, man, you look at the Japanese right now, they are really building a lot of airplanes and they are training a lot of pilots. Something's going to happen. And so are the Germans. So we better get with it. So Congress passed a government civilian pilot, civilian pilot training program in 1939. It's a government program. The goal of the program was to train about 20,000 pilots a year. They started out with 11 universities and spread to some 1,100 universities as we progressed. And when you look at the end of it, 75% of 435,000 graduates were trained on Cubs. Cubs were the main training aircraft. And of course, 80% of the military pilots initially trained on Cubs. Some of them, rather than go through the complete training program because they were certified, got credit for at least part of their training. To continue, this is an interesting guy. Marcus Poston, as I was kind of reading along, looking for a background. He was a mechanic, second class Navy enlisted man. I guess in Hawaii before Pearl Harbor, he didn't have a lot to do, so he said, you know what, I think I want to fly. So he went out to KT Aviation one day and he said, okay, I'd like to take some flying lessons. So the first day he soloed, guess what day that was? December 7th. So as the story goes, here he is flying down Oahu Valley, and he suddenly is surrounded by these Japanese airplanes, and he's shot down. And for some reason, he was carrying a parachute, and he bailed out, and he lived to fight through the rest of the war. But I thought that was an interesting story to pass on to you all. Then you look at famous people who frequently travel in an L4. You've got Eleanor Roosevelt. She was in an L4 all the time, going from place to place. General Dwight Eisenhower was a pilot, and so he flew himself around a lot in an L4. Our Chief of Staff of the Army flew in one, and George Patton, as a pilot, naturally, flew around the battlefield in one of those. The other things that I found interesting had to do with the Pacific Theater. One of them was a Brody system. You know, and I got to tell you, I don't think I thought much about this until I started reading about this. But when our Navy was island hopping, and as you all know, that was the strategy for how we were eventually going to island hop our way all the way to Japan, and then we were going to have to finally conduct an invasion on Japan. But when you get out there, a lot of these Japanese islands, I mean, the only airfield on that island was held by the Japanese. And so you get a small airplane for reconnaissance like the L4 or the L5, where do you take off? I mean, maybe the island's at your max range. You're going to see our max range here in a bit. And it basically was about 2.5 hours, 3 hours, and that's all the fuel you had. So we had to figure out how do you take things off, these things off, to get them close to the island so you can have a decent reconnaissance period as you're flying over this enemy island before an invasion. So a guy by the name of Brody rigged this system. So basically this is an LST, which is normally a landing craft where you're dispersing either Army soldiers on an island or Marines. And he said, well, you know, if you erect about 3 to 4 poles, you string a cable across it, you rig a mechanism on the airplane so it's a big loop on the top of the wing, and then you rig a hook that you can land on, by golly, we think that'll work. And so it did. And so these guys come along at near stall speed, hook the ring over the hook, and land on the cable. And by the time you get down to almost 200 feet of cable, you're slowed down enough because of the lag to stop the airplane. And then they said, well, can we take off? And the bottom line was, yes. You turn the hook around, you turn the loop around, take the airplane off the loop, put it back on the loop, and you can have enough speed at that low stall speed to take off and go do your reconnaissance. So I thought you ought to know about the Brody system. And then this is kind of interesting. So the next one was a jury-rigged aircraft carrier. So this is an LST also. And so what we did here, what the engineers did was build a wooden plank runway for L aircraft. And so you can see about 6 of them loaded on board, 7th about ready to take off. These guys could scoot in very close within range, within L range of an enemy island, and take off, go do your reconnaissance, come back and land. And so most of 1944 and 1945, these 2 devices were used for scouting islands that were about ready to be invaded. So I thought you had to know about that. So let's get into the L5 Stinson, which is Bill Barclay's baby. We'll talk about some general information first and then get on to some of the specifics. So that was manufactured by Stinson Division of Vultee Aircraft Company in Wayne, Michigan, Nashville, Tennessee. Later, it became Consolidated Vultee, and they manufactured airplanes from November 1942 through September 1945. These, unlike the Cub, were made exclusively for the military. No civilian counterpart, about 3,590 of them built. I mentioned that over 700 were the B model, capable of medevac type missions. And the prototype was a Model 76. It became the L5 in April of 1942. And all the people that worked in the plant said this is such a rugged airplane. We call it the Flying Jeep, so it kind of carried that name into the future. When you look at it, this is another high-wing airplane, so you can see if you're flying in this thing, you're the pilot or the observer. You look out left or right, you've got excellent view, and if you bank the airplane a little bit, you've got an even better view. And by golly, because it has a slow stall speed also, about 42 miles an hour, you can get down there and you can look in the weeds looking for bad guys, where they are, what theirs is. It a command post? Is it a bunker complex? What is it? Great reconnaissance airplane. I won't say much about the, I won't say much about the wings and structure. You can read that. Again, a crew of 2, and it was fielded to the U.S. Army, Air Force, the Marine Corps, and the Royal Air Force. There are some characteristics of it in terms of size. You can see it's a tad bigger and heavier, 15,000 empty, as opposed to 700 and some odd in the Cub. Gross weight takeoff about 2,250 pounds. It's powered by a 185 horsepower 6-cylinder engine. And like the Cub, it's got a 2-bladed wooden fixed pitch blade. I bumped the 2 of them up together to kind of compare their characteristics and their performance comparison. So you can see that the L5 is faster, cruises faster, has a little higher stall speed, has a greater range, 225 miles or 3 hours versus 375 versus 3.5 hours. Service ceiling of 11,500 feet versus 15,800 feet. Rate of climb is faster in the L5, 900 feet per minute. Both great airplanes, both light airplanes, both very capable airplanes for what they do. And so when you look at what they were designed to do, you see that the top mission is liaison. And everybody says, well, what's liaison? And I mean, it's kind of a catch-all phrase, basically, but it means contact with something. So you're either taking somebody to do something for a meeting, you're rescuing somebody, you're resupplying somebody, those kind of things. You're bringing P on somebody if you're in close air support or artillery mission. Great also for search and rescue, forward air control, reconnaissance. We talked about the medical evacuation piece. Resupply, either landing in some clandestine area or dropping a parachute supply to some good guys on the ground that need it. And also involved in psychological operations. You could rig either one of these airplanes, quite frankly, with a loudspeaker system for PSYOPs to try to get people to surrender. You could lay commo wire with it because of your ability to fly slow. You could disperse smoke with it by putting a smoke dispenser on it. And of course, you could rig it for attack. And I will tell you, as I read these vignettes and the books that Bill gave me, people mounted machine guns on them. We're going to see a little story here where we have a guy that mounted 6 bazookas on him to go after tanks in Europe. People brought machine guns with them, handguns, piles of boxes of grenades to drop on bad guys. And so your imagination is the wildest and is the limit, I should say. All right, so let's talk a little bit about military pilots. We had Don give a great lecture at one point in time, probably about a year ago, on pilot training. So there was a standard training program, 3 phases: primary training, basic training, advanced training. And initially they were 3 months each, so it took about 9 months to get your pilot's wings. And then as we got involved in the war and we started taking casualties, we said, oops, we need to do it faster than that. And so we reduced it to 10 weeks for each phase of training, and then ultimately reduced it to 9 weeks of training. I would mention that initially the requirement to be a pilot was to have a college education. We learned very quickly in the country that, oh, we don't have very many of those guys around, so how about a little bit of college? And so that then became the next criteria. And after they finished all phases of training, if you had a little bit of college, and my dad was in that. My dad was a World War II guy, Korean War guy, Vietnam guy, and he was an aviation cadet. He had 1 semester of college, that was it. But he was eventually able to graduate, be awarded his wings, and be commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant. And then what happened to those fellows after they were commissioned and got their wings is they were married up with an aircraft that they would put about 200 to 400 hours on before they would take that aircraft or fall in on an aircraft already in theater and fly that aircraft and have some experience on it before they went. And that's the way that program worked. And then as I began reading, I said, okay, I'm learning a lot more about this sergeant's program, and obviously we needed a lot more pilots. Just take a look at the casualties. We lost about 62,000 airplanes in World War II, 50,000 of them in combat. That results in losing over 70,000 pilots and crew members. So in order to stay up with the need, and remember we were producing at the same time 300,000 airplanes over the period of the war, so we needed to do something to fill the pilot shortage. So the sergeant's program was started, and it was for non-college graduates, obviously. It was because of the combat training losses and the training losses. I mean, we lost 15,000 in America who never made it to either theater or not in training accidents. So in 1941, Congress authorized this flying sergeant's program. They were enlisted, they earned staff sergeant rank. They served as instructors, transport pilots, mostly utility roles, such as in our great L-birds. But I got to tell you, they were every bit as courageous as any other pilot that was being produced in the other program. They never were in command of anybody. There were about 2,576 flying sergeants who served during the war. Most of the flying sergeants were elevated to the rank of flight officer, and that's equivalent to probably low-ranking warrant officers in today's armed forces. 217 of them flew combat missions as flying sergeants. Some flew with elite fighter groups, such as the 82nd in Europe, where they downed 130 airplanes. 9 of them became aces, by the way, which means that you've knocked down at least 5 enemy airplanes. I think most of you know that. Altogether, the flying sergeants in World War II downed 249.5 enemy planes. And we had a discussion the other day when I was going through a briefing of this beforehand. They said, how do you get 0.5? And the idea is that if 2 guys claim 1 airplane, they get credit for it, and every now and then you end up with a 0.5. And then there was a fellow by the name of William Shawn, who alone bagged 12 victories. 7 World War II flying sergeants became general officers. So then I said, okay, well, where were these guys located on the battlefield? And so the first thing I said was, well, let's find out what the normal organization is. So they were organized by squadron. So it was 32 aircraft in a squadron and 100 men. There were a combination of pilots, crew, and mechanics. And so the way it worked out, there were 5 officer pilots in a squadron, 65 sergeant pilots in a squadron. That's a lot of them. So you see, we did have a lot of sergeants out there flying. And about 20 of them were mechanics. So then when you look at the size of the organizations that break down, first element we looked at is a field army. So in a field army, you got about 2 to 3 million men, mostly men, some women. But there was a squadron attached to that field army. And then, then the next largest group that you're looking at is an army group. There are about 125,000 in an army group. There was a squadron assigned there. And then here's where we really get down where the meat meets the matter. And that is in the Army division, about 15 to 17,000 men in an Army division. And so we had 6 to 10 pilots or aircraft, plus 4 or 5 mechanics in each division. And those airplanes could be assigned anywhere throughout the area of operations for that division. And then, of course, within each division, you had an artillery brigade and probably about 3 or 4 battalions, artillery battalions in each artillery brigade. So in each battalion and brigade, there were 2 pilots and 2 aircraft and 1 mechanic. And then, last but not least, when you look at where these guys operated, they operated all over the world, wherever the war was. So you had them in Western Europe, you had them in Italy, you had them in the Philippines, you had them in New Guinea, and also in the China, Burma, India theater. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit more about specific missions. And one is forward air control, and one is adjusting artillery, or forward observer duty. So we got talking in there the other day and said, I was talking about grids. And I want to talk about a company commander and how he programs artillery. And it's in a grid system. And so one of the guys in there said, well, Ted, what's a grid system? I said, can you add some slides on that? So I said, okay, let's try it. So here is a view of the, whoops, I got a wild right thumb here, I guess. Here is the grid system. This is a typical longitude, latitude markers, and that's the way we're organized in this world. And so when you look next at what it looks like in a region, so here's the European theater. And so this would have been the way that we looked at it in World War II. There's Germany, there's Italy, there's Austria, Switzerland, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, England, so forth. And then when you broke that down even further, if you're on the ground, you're a ground guy, you're going to carry a 1/50,000 map. And so that's broken out into grid squares. And most of the world talks about distances in terms of kilometers, not miles. And so when you're in the military service on the ground, you're dealing with maps that are in kilometers, not miles. So each square up here is a kilometer. And so that's the 1,000 meters by 1,000 meters. And you can see, I don't know how experienced most of you are in map reading, but these are terrain features, so you can see that there are hills and valleys. You can see that there are cities here. And so that if you're a company commander and you're trying to plot targets so that you can bring artillery in there, you are getting down to details within a grid coordinate. So let's say we're going to bring artillery in on Cravini. Then you look at the grid square this way. So here is a 1,000-yard or meter grid square. That's divided off by 100 meters, and that is horizontally and longitudinally. So if that's that city that I just mentioned, and I want to bring an artillery target there, I count from left to right on the latitudinal side, so that's 600 meters in, and it's 600 meters north longitudinally, and that's my target. So if I'm a company commander, I'm picking those grids, and I'm going to make a list of my targets in accordance with the grid, and I'm also probably going to give them an overlay. So there's two ways of looking at this way. So an overlay means you're taking a thin sheet of paper, you're putting it over a map, and you are plotting by grid square where the targets are. So the guy, the artilleryman who receives that information, he's got plots that he can apply to a map, and he's also got a listing to double check things. And so that's a quick lesson on the grid square and how that works and how a company commander uses it. So the next thing I want to do is, as we get into the mission, I think it's important to talk about the FO business and target selection, but I'm going to talk at it from a ground commander's perspective. And this is what has to happen. So in my day, when I was a company commander, I worked with my forward observer, and we selected targets together. I'd say, Ski, we're going to move here today, so I want to target there, I want to target there, I want to target there, and we'd list the grid, and he'd call it in through artillery channels for me. Back in the World War II days, if you were a company commander, the company commander did all the planning. And he picked targets, whether it was a city, whether it was a piece of high ground, that kind of thing. When he got that data, what he would do is send a runner 15 kilometers to the rear, which was normally the distance a battalion headquarters was. That battalion would receive that information. There was an artillery liaison officer at each battalion headquarters, and that liaison officer would walk the operations officer, the S3, through what the targets were. They'd collectively decide whether that is to be an approved target or not. And then that target would be sent up to the fire support batteries, and they would be plotted and ready to shoot. And at the same time, they'd go to the fire direction center that controlled all the firing batteries for priority of fire. That's how it worked. The other trick was then, okay, I got to figure out, how do I talk to people? So when you look at the radios that they had back in World War II, the company commander had communication with his headquarters, the battalion headquarters. He didn't have communication with anybody else. He didn't have an artilleryman there. So if he wanted adjustment, he had to talk to the battalion headquarters. So then we get involved in our mission with the L aircraft. And let's see, what have I forgotten here? I think we're good to go. But then when you look at, and I'm going to give you a vignette here so you can digest this hopefully a little better than now. But let's talk about close air support. Back in those days, same thing. So the company commander knew when he was plotting his targets that he was plotting targets for close air support if airplanes happened to be flying by and be diverted to support him. So it was the same plotting process. However, here's what happened. So if you were a company commander, you remember we talked about the L airplanes being designated 2 per battalion, artillery battalion, 2 per artillery brigade. So there were plenty of airplanes out there to support that ground commander. So 1 or 2 of those airplanes would be designated to support the tactical operation, and they knew, in accordance with the information that they received from the battalion and the fire direction center, they knew when the artillery was to be planned, so they would plan their flight in that area of operations in time to be able to watch the artillery strike the ground and then to be able to adjust. So they were in touch with the fire direction center by radio. And by the way, back in those days, there was a nav radio on one of these aircraft, and there was a communications radio for air traffic. And then the forward observer brought in this 25-pound radio. That was the main radio that was used for adjustment with the artillery batteries. The company commander on the ground would watch where he thought he plotted his artillery, And if it was wrong and it needed to be adjusted because all the guns weren't aligned properly, so you might have one long, left, right, short, whatever it was, he could call in to a just fire mission. And he might say, shift left 50, shift left 100, 100 left, 100 long, 100 short. So he finally walked that artillery on the ground, but most of the time, good percentage of the time, the company commander couldn't see where the rounds were falling, so it was up to the L5 in the air to make those adjustments. And that's how it worked. And the guy in the battalion headquarters had to decide, who do I listen to? Do I listen to the company commander, or do I listen to the FO and the L5? And they kind of worked it out between the two of them, but they did not have the communications that obviously we had in Vietnam and we've had in our wars since that time. So let's look at a vignette, and it's the Hurtgen Forest vignette. It's the end of the Hurtgen battle. And just to kind of put you in the ballpark, here is where the Hurtgen Forest battle took place. And so to give you some kind of reference, here's England, this is France, here we have Luxembourg, then we have Belgium up in here, so it's in that area. So what I want to do next is tell you a little bit about the Hurtgen Forest battle. So the Hurtgen Forest was a huge area, and historians will argue whether the battle was really necessary or not. We're not going to argue that today, but this started on the 15th of September 1944 and went through the 16th of December 1944. Over that period of time, there were 6 infantry divisions that were just meat ground in that forest by the Germans. There were 28,000 American casualties in that battle, and the final assault was on the 15th and 16th of December 1944, and that's what I'm going to talk about. And this is the guy I'm going to talk about. His name is Paul Bosch. Paul Bosch volunteered for the Army in 1941, as soon as December 7th occurred. He was a professional wrestler by trade, and he was a promoter. I mean, he was a sports broadcaster, just a great guy, physically fit. Ended up going to officer candidate school, and then was commissioned as an infantry officer, and was the commander of G Company, 121st Infantry Regiment, 8th Infantry Division, on the 15th of December 1944. And the reason I picked him was that when I was a battalion commander in Europe of a mechanized infantry battalion, I took my officers and senior NCOs on 3 what we called officer professional development terrain walks. And I was trying to teach them something each different terrain walk. So I took them to Hurtgen Forest to show how you could really get gummed up by not being using your initiative to try to figure out the best way around a particular obstacle. And we coordinated to have this guy, Paul, join us there. At that time, he was 74 years old. And he was, I got to tell you, he was a lively, energetic 74 years old. He was 32 years old at the time of the battle, so a little older than most other commanders at that time. And I'll tell you what, I think he turned 32 all over again. He was just a great guy. And I walked every step of that battlefield with him, and we talked about artillery, and we talked about close air support, and I'm going to share that with you because that's a good way to bring in the aircraft and what role they played. So first of all, he had artillery and mortars planned. He was a good company commander, and it was all approved. We had air superiority at that time, as most of you know, and so we had a lot of P-47s in the air flying our way every day, and if you happened to grab 1, 2, 3, or 4, a flight of them, that was always happily accepted by ground guys. And the L5s were in the air throughout that period of time. And a lot of time, Paul shared with me that his visibility was not very good, and I'll explain that. But this is what it looks like. This was his assembly area. And these are, by the way, these are M4 tanks. This is a P-47 rolling in hot. This is kind of the battlefield, and I know that's kind of confusing, so I'm going to walk this through with you. So here is the town of Hurtgen. That's about a mile long. This is not an actual graphic map. This town was vacated, that town was vacated, this town was vacated, this town was under U.S. control. And so we were at the end of the battle for Hurtgen Forest. and this town needed to be taken, and there were probably about 200 German soldiers there. And so Paul was given the mission with his company of attacking that town and taking that town. And so he was in an assembly area downhill along a stream bed. This was a hillside here, about 200 feet high. And from the top of the hillside, there was a beautiful German forest up there, this was about 1,200 meters, almost a mile, from the edge of the forest to the beginning of the town. So Paul had done absolute superb planning. So I want you to picture this. So here he's got, normally he would have about 160 men. So he's down to about 100 men now. It's early in the morning, it's still dark. It's December 16th or 15th. It is colder than all get out. I'll keep it clean. And these guys are down there, and they know they're going to make an attack against an overwhelming German force. He's planned artillery. He's planned attack air support if he can get it. I know that Paul told me that his gut was wrenching, although he was calm on the outside. I know how that feels. And his men were quiet. They were cold. Artillery is supposed to start at 5 o'clock, which means the L5 is in the air at about 4:45. And by the way, see this red circle here? So artillery is coming in from about 12 miles this way, flying directly over the head of Paul and his men, landing all over the town of Hurtgen. At the same time, he can hear the L5 running a racetrack configuration kind of a course. And they've got to do that to stay out of the way. And by the way, back in those days too, close air support came over the heads from behind of the good guys to get to the bad guys. We started in Vietnam to do it parallel to the friendly forces, which was much safer because it was easy and sometimes, particularly in limited visibility, to mistake the good guys for the bad guys, and so we had some friendly fire. And nevertheless, we still had friendly fire in Vietnam and subsequent wars, but that was the best way to try to avoid that kind of thing. So you can imagine Paul. So the artillery fire starts at 5 o'clock in the morning, just getting, still pitch black really, not getting light until about 6. So these guys are flying this circular configuration at 5 in the morning. They're the ones that are adjusting the artillery because Paul can't see. He is climbing this 200-foot hill. He gets up into a heavy forest. He moves forward in the forest to the edge of the wood line where when the sun comes up, he can now look out and see Hurtgen. And fortunately for him, the L5s are right on target. And then Paul begins to move out of the forest area and just gets hammered because they've got anti-tank weapons in there. By the way, Paul's got 4 M4 tanks assigned to him, and they begin to take anti-tank fire. So the tanks turn around and scoot back into the wood line so they can't be seen. Paul has to hit the deck not to be killed. And these great airplanes brought artillery in all day long on Hurtgen to soften it up. And at least twice there were 2 P-47 attack air attacks that Paul had nothing to do with. He said, Ted, I couldn't see him, I couldn't talk to him, I couldn't adjust him, so I had to rely on the L5 and his judgment with regard to where those bombs were being dropped by the P-47s that were coming in supporting him. So the bottom line is he had to go back into the woods that night, the night of the 15th, and hide out. Dark, pitch black, cold, and then get up the next morning and do the same thing. Well, fortunately, because that town had been softened up by both artillery and attack air, I'll tell you, by the end of the day, second day, Paul had won the fight. I think there were only about 60 Germans left. I think Paul lost about 10 men that day and probably about 15 more wounded. And we took the day and took the last objective in the battle for the Hurtgen Forest. And there's an after story, if you're interested, that I'll tell you. We ran into a couple of Germans that day, and if you're interested in that, during the Q&A, we'll talk about that. But anyway, that's how it worked. That's how it worked from the ground level. So it wasn't totally under control, but the point is, you had great, courageous pilots here flying this routine. And by the way, sometimes for close air support, these guys would have smoke grenades on board, and so they would break out of this circular configuration, fly over in and around Hurtgen and drop these smoke grenades from about 25 feet off the ground, exposing themselves to enemy fire. And these are sergeants flying these things. So you talk about courage. I'll tell you, these guys flying these Liaison aircraft, they had a lot of courage, and they laid it out every day. Just great guys. Okay, let's go into vignette number 2. This is the Battle of Ericourt, and this is a September battle. So we have landed at Normandy. We've worked our way across into the Lorraine region of France, which is where this occurred, and Ericourt was located right there. And so that gets you in the ballpark. I want to give you a little bit of background. Then we're going to look at a video, which we've worked hard to do here for the first time, and hopefully it'll work. But anyway, so the battle was fought basically southeast of the town of Ericourt, Lorraine, France. It was fought during this period of time, 18 through 29 September. It was fought because the German 5th Panzer Army had been given the mission to retake the town and the crossing point across the Mosel. We needed a bunch of crossing points across the Rhine, across the Mosel, to get into the heartland of Germany. So we were working hard at trying to capture crossing points. It turned out to be one of the largest tank battles of the war because there were 2 major brigades from the 5th Panzer Army, and they were all equipped with the latest Panther tanks and Tiger tanks, which outperformed our M4, by the way. The only thing we had the advantage of with regard to technology was that we had a faster turret. And it turns out that our guys really knew the tank well, and so we were able to turn our turrets quickly when we had engagement and kill those guys from the flank before they were able to kill them. They were full of new crews, couldn't read a map, and not very well trained within the turret with regard to turret skills, and so they ended up losing in the long run. But we were far less manned, and we only had about 200 M4 Sherman tanks. And again, we had established air superiority, so that helped. And this is what the battlefield looked like at about the 5th day in. And I want to show you this because I know it's confusing to you. These are all terrain features. So here's a hill mass, here's a valley. Most of our guys are in assembly areas in company formations. So these are tanks, these are tank companies, so that's about 12 to 14 tanks. This is a mechanized infantry company, another tank company, and so on. This is only a piece of the battlefield. But we positioned ourselves around key cities, around key avenues of approach into our area. The Germans were attacking us, we weren't attacking them. And so we had the capability, because we had L5s and L4s performing reconnaissance, we could get out and see where they were marshaling. We kind of figured where they were going. We'd get our engineers out to create obstacles so they would be blocked, and then we knew exactly where to move each one of these companies around to the flank so we could get at the soft spots of their more superior tanks. And that's kind of the setup for the thing. One of the primary key leaders of their aviation assets, and this is with the 4th Armored Division under Bruce Clark, Colonel Bruce Clark, task force from him, was this guy. His name was Charlie Carpenter. He happened to be a major in the United States Army, and he rigged his L4 up with 3 bazookas barrels on each strut. And he went after the tanks. Not only did he do FO duty, not only did he do close air support duty, but he wanted to be a killer. So I wanted to show you a little, this is a cartoon video, but I think you'll get a kick out of this because it shows his aggressiveness. And quite frankly, we didn't have the wherewithal back then to film this and his aggressiveness. So let's try this, guys, see if it works.
It's September 1944. The Battle of Ericourt is underway. The German 5th Panzer Army was up against the U.S. 4th Armored Division. The Germans outnumbered the American forces. The U.S. forces had the advantage of air superiority, but the Germans had better gun range. Heavy fog is set in around the combatants, and the playing field is level. Under cover of the fog, German Panthers had advanced towards the U.S. headquarters and had the Americans pinned down. Taking off in his Piper and Stinson Grasshopper from a field nearby is Major Charles Carpenter, an observation pilot. The Grasshopper is a light aircraft made of fabric over a steel frame, with a top speed of just 85 miles per hour, essential to the push through Europe. These soldiers could see the hidden German army that lay frequently in ambush, causing havoc for the Allies as they pushed through France towards Germany. Although today, the fog has prevented Charles II from seeing what is happening below. Around noon, the fog and low cloud that has been covering the battlefield starts to clear. It's at this moment, through the mist, that Carpenter sees several German Panther tanks heading towards Aragon. Without hesitation, Carpenter wheels his slow-moving bird around and starts to dive towards the Germans below. Charles's actions will make him and his Grasshopper famous. This isn't just any Piper Al-4. This Grasshopper bites back. Armed with 6 bazookas, 3 under each wing, this little plane packs a punch and has been christened with the name Rosie the Rocketer. Back inside the cockpit, Charles is at the controls. He's added a special panel on the console, upon which there are 6 switches, 1 for each bazooka. Charles can activate each one, or fire a salvo of all 6 if necessary. Charles knows that the armor on top of the German tanks is relatively thin and only went up to 45mm on the heaviest of tanks. With each bazooka able to penetrate 99mm, Rosie was more than capable of raining down deadly force on the unsuspecting tank crews below. Pushing the plane into a deep dive, Charlie flicks 2 switches on his customized panel on the console. There's a brief puff of smoke as the electricity ignites the charge and the rocket powers towards its intended target of a German Panther below, smashing into the turret and creating a barrage of molten hot shrapnel inside. The Iron Beast splutters its last and grinds to a halt. Pulling on the stick and out of the deep dive, Carpenter allows himself a moment of triumph as he escapes the flurry of small arms fire that is now buzzing all around Rosie. Usually the Germans don't fire at splutters as it gives away their positions, but realizing this pilot isn't flying the usual harmless type of Grasshopper, they desperately try to hit the escaping plane. Carpenter doesn't go far. Gaining enough height, he pushes forward again to line up his next target. This time, the Germans are ready, and Rosie doesn't completely escape the hail of lead. Unperturbed, Charles takes out his second prize of the day, and another Panther is stopped in the field. Despite the fire from below, Carpenter used all his rockets and headed back to base, leaving dead behind him. Landing back at base, Carpenter refueled and rearmed Rosie, took off again, and headed back to the column. The Germans were waiting through everything they had at Charles and Rosie. Charles managed to do several attack runs using his full complement of rockets, and then incredibly headed back to base, rearmed and refueled, and engaged the Germans a 3rd time. The Grasshopper was made of fabric stretched over a metal frame and had a huge amount of lift for its size. As such, it could take several hits from small arms fire, and provided they didn't hit anything essential, such as the pilot or the engine, the plane could shrug off holes in the wings or fuselage. Having destroyed or immobilized several tanks and armored vehicles, the remaining Panthers were forced to retreat, and Charles decided that was enough for one day. Interviewed by Stars and Strikes magazine, Charles told the reporter his idea of war was to attack, and then attack again. When asked what the enemy made of Charles, he said, "Word must be getting around to watch out for cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now, they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit." Not one to just battle in the air, Charles was no stranger.
Okay, how about that for aggressiveness? What a great American leader. I just want to kind of give you some feedback on the fact that we really won that battle. We left the Germans with, gosh, I don't know, somewhere between 20 and 60 tanks. We still had the preponderance of ours. I think we lost something like 50 tanks. Why did we win? We had better intelligence. We could use the terrain. Our guys could read the map. They used the turret well. They were better trained in every respect. And of course, we had audacious soldiers and airmen who did a fantastic job with close air support and with gutsy guys like Major Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, and a great airplane like the L-4 to help us win that battle. I just want to cover a little bit, we're near the end of this thing. I want to talk a little bit about the Pacific because I would be remiss if I did not do that. And I selected the 25th Liaison Squadron as an example of the kinds of missions that were performed in the Pacific. Many of them were the same, but because of the really austere terrain there, I mean, we're pretty well settled in Europe. Most of the land there is manicured, so you've got trees on the hills and you've got farm fields and open ground on the valleys, unlike in the Pacific, where you have a lot of jungle. You have runways cleared out of the jungle, and you have the Japanese hiding in the jungle all over the place. And so this outfit was formed and trained in the United States and moved to northern Australia at an airfield with the 5th Army Air Forces. And that was a bomber base. And so these guys came in with a bunch of L5s, and they assembled them right there in the bomber base. And I'll tell you, they took nothing but teasing. Most of them were sergeants. These were small airplanes. They were fabric airplanes with metal frames. They didn't really have a mission when they arrived in the Pacific. And so they really got made fun of. But the guys couldn't fly their girlfriends, their Australian girlfriends, around the bombers. And so they very quickly became friends with the Liaison Squadron. And obviously they won their favor very quickly because they could take their girlfriends up in the airplanes. That's kind of a little side story. And then they moved out to operations in New Guinea and really began finding out what their missions were. So obviously there was close air support piece, there was an artillery piece, but there were a bunch of other pieces in there as they began to recon. For example, one man, Smith, found a bunch of Indian soldiers out in the middle of the jungle. Turns out they had escaped from a Japanese prisoner of war camp. There were 20 of them. And so the former prisoners of war made a sign in rocks, SOS, help us. And so eventually they communicated, he landed, found out who they were, and then over the next several days, he and about 5 other airplanes, L5s, delivered weapons, tools, and those kinds of things to strip out an airfield. And eventually those 20 guys were taken out of there all by L5s and saved. So that was a rescue mission. There's a story about an L5, just like Bill's over here, that rescued a wounded man with a bad chest wound, needed a handheld respirator and a hand-operated respirator, was going to die, and the L pilot who rescued him and got him out of the jungle had to lean back, fly the airplane at the same time, operating the respirator machine for over an hour until they got this guy back to the hospital and he lived. But that's one of the kinds of missions that they did. There's a talk about, a story about on New Guinea also, about Japanese that were routed out of some defensive position, and they escaped or were escaping in a bunch of native canoes. An L5 pilot found them, went back and got some machine guns and grenades, came back and wiped them all out. But that's, that's another aggressive L5 pilot. Of course, they were heavily involved in spotter missions, and one of them mounted a machine gun in his L5 and took down a Japanese, an old Japanese fighter with a machine gun out of an L5. Then there's a story a little later on in Iwo Jima about a bunch of great L pilots who flew up and down the coastline the whole initial attack and calling in fire missions, calling in wounded soldiers and that kind of thing. One of them never made it back, was shot down somewhere along the line. But there are just bunches of stories like that. I could talk for probably another hour on stories, but I think I've reached my limit. And so I would say in summary, fun talking to you all today. It was about 2 great airplanes. And you know, when you look at one of the factors that caused the Allies to win the war, was American industrial might. So boy, we were pumping these airplanes out, and boy, did they do a great job, combined with the training, tenacity, initiative, skill of the American soldier and pilot. And with a combo, boy, you had a winning combination, and that ends my presentation. So hope you enjoyed it.